Jim Crow. That name is evocative to many Americans and people around the world. It's synonymous with racism, hate, and violence. More than 50 years after the death of Jim Crow, the name alone still elicits discomfort, anxiety, and guilt. But who was Jim Crow? I'm your host, Jack, with today's essential question. In the United States, during the 1820s, an entertainment trend swept the country in the form of traveling variety acts called minstrel shows. The most famous performer of these minstrels was Thomas D. Rice. His popularity and rising fame came from the different way he performed, by smearing burnt cork on his face. While we cannot say that Rice was the first minstrel who performed in blackface, he is often seen by historians as the father of minstrelsy, and was the most prominent performer of blackface minstrel shows in the early 19th century. Rice portrayed a stereotyped caricature of Black Americans. He sang, danced, and made offensive jokes. His most famous character, and the one that launched his career and fame, who would change the world forever, was called Daddy Pop's Jim Crow. Rice's most famous performance was a song called Jump Jim Crow, which he allegedly overheard a black farmhand in the South singing, who at the time was likely a slave. Rice would sing the song and dance the cakewalk, which looks like this. These shows were widely popular with white American audiences. The masses in both North and South delighted in these portrayals, found them funny. And learning the various songs that Rice and other minstrels performed became commonplace among white Americans at the time. Not everyone found them funny, particularly abolitionists and Black Americans. Freedmen often boycotted these shows, but despite their best efforts, minstrel shows found great success in capturing audiences all across the United States. Frederick Douglass wrote that minstrels were the filthy scum of white society, who stolen from us a complexion denied to them by nature, in which to make money and pander to the corrupt taste of their white fellow citizens. During the years after Rice, America saw the births of other famous characters worth noting, including Zip Coon, a portrayal of free yet pompous and uneducated Black Americans. It saw Mr. Tambo and Mr. Bones, both named for the instruments they played during their renditions of Black American folk music. While you may be thinking that these performances and characters were only limited to the 1800s, minstrels in blackface have spanned well into the 20th and 21st centuries. Disney's 1941 Dumbo included a scene with a character directly named Jim Crow that mimicked a typical minstrel song and dance. This scene was later pulled from the movie upon its release on Disney+, and altogether left out of its 2019 remake by director Tim Burton. In 1952, Glenn Turnbull performed as Mr. Bones in I Dream of Jeannie, with an entire cast of actors in blackface.
With an exhibition of eye-dazzling, leg-spraddling, foot-flapping fantasy, playing the bones at the same time.
1974 saw the Merv Griffin Show with comedian Pat Paulson dressed in blackface as he performed offensive jokes targeted at minorities.
I really think it's terrible what's happening in this country and jokes they make about minorities. I'd like to give you some examples of this bigoted humor. For instance, a joke I heard recently about my Polish friends. Why are there two pallbearers at a Polish funeral? Because it only takes two men to carry a garbage can.
This scene was never aired, but was released in the extras on a DVD collection. The Black and White Minstrel Show aired on BBC Primetime TV for 10 years, and after its cancellation toured live until 1987. Blackface continued to be seen in college yearbooks, at minstrel shows and reenactments held in private, and at private parties up through the 1980s and 1990s.
Nenge Yomboko! From Cameroon. Do you remember me? It's Lionel Joseph.
Lionel! From the African Education Conference, right?
Yes, Simon. I was director of cultural events at the Haile Selassie Pavilion.
I remember the pavilion. We had big fun there.
Even into the 21st century, scandals with politicians having attended these parties and university functions in blackface continue to emerge. Jim Crow's association in the modern era stems from these minstrel shows. Rice's character became so widely known that by the time he stopped performing, Jim Crow became synonymous with Negro. These derogatory and offensive portrayals of Black Americans created an image to white audiences where black meant lesser illiterate, and uneducated. The character Jim Crow became a symbol of all Black Americans in the country. And after the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which outlawed slavery, gave equal rights to all citizens, and established equal voting rights for Black Americans and former slaves, many U.S. states began passing laws legalizing racial segregation. These laws were officially called the Black Codes, but colloquially, they became known as Jim Crow laws. These laws were the reactionary stance taken by racist lawmakers across the United States, primarily in the Southern Bloc states, towards emancipation and legal enfranchisement with the right to vote of Black Americans. Politicians advocating these laws were called redeemers. They rose to power in these states following the end of Reconstruction and came almost entirely from the Democratic Party. States who wanted to continue the separation of Black and white citizens began proposing a doctrine called separate but equal. This equal never lived up to its name. White Americans were given first access, and oftentimes better access, to water fountains, bathrooms, and entrances and exits to buildings, seating on public transportation, while Black citizens often received inferior accommodations. This is the era of large signs with the words "colored only" printed above public facilities, and laws that forbade Black Americans from sitting in desirable sections of public buses, auditoriums, and going to their preference of public schools. These laws also extended to voting. Many states began introducing poll taxes that many Black Americans could not afford, as well as literacy and comprehension tests designed to disqualify non-white citizens from being able to vote. One of the most famous disenfranchisement laws was the Grandfather Clause, that dictated that voters were only allowed to vote if their ancestors had previously voted in the state. This disqualified former slaves and many freedmen who were unable or disallowed to vote in previous elections. These laws were so severe that by 1900, only 0.5% of the eligible Black population was registered to vote in Louisiana. The enforcement of further social segregation that local and state governments were unable to enforce was often taken up by vigilante groups, paramilitary organizations, and terrorist groups such as the Red Shirts, the White League, and most infamously, the Ku Klux Klan. These organizations used violence to intimidate Black Americans who could pay the poll tax or pass literacy tests. These men were threatened, attacked, tortured, and killed, often publicly and ritualistically. Between the years 1882 and 1968, 4,743 people were lynched in the United States. These scenes are so brutal that we refuse to show them here on YouTube. If you want to look them up on your own, be warned they are graphic and disturbing. Historically, lynching became recognized as a federal hate crime on February 26, 2020, more than 50 years after the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. While there are many politicians we could and will cover in a future episode on the 1960s civil rights movement more thoroughly, the biggest public face of Jim Crow laws and the most well-known association of Jim Crow to a politician was Governor George Wallace from Alabama. He served from 1963 to 1967, as well as 3 other terms in the 1970s and into the mid-1980s. Let's take a listen to a famous line from his inauguration speech in 1963.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Wallace gains much of his infamy from his governorship during the harshest times for civil rights activists. This included the Birmingham campaign, where the police chief, Bull Connor, turned police dogs on nonviolent protesters and children, as well as the march in Selma, Alabama, where Wallace himself ordered state troopers to stop the march using any means necessary. While Jim Crow was dismantled federally in 1965 with the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Wallace sought to undo that in 1968 when he ran as a third-party candidate in the presidential election against Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. He ran for the American Independent Party and is the most recent third-party candidate to actually win electoral votes, taking Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. He also secured 1 vote in North Carolina where an elector defected. Thomas Rice made his fame with Daddy Pop's Jim Crow, a caricature that ridiculed Black Americans and reduced their culture to false stereotypes and a narrative that cast them as inferior to white citizens. The effects that the Jim Crow mindset had on Americans is demonstrated in the creation of racist laws, the rise in popularity of racist politicians, and the formation of hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Those effects are still seen today, in other ways, but that may be a subject for another time. I've been your host, Jack, with The Essential Question. Thank you for watching.